Hello and welcome to the classic Chinese novel in popular culture, which is part of this year's Star Talk teacher training program on the Chinese classic novel as a bridge to linguistic and intercultural competence. My name is Frederick Green. My Chinese name is Ge Hao De, and I teach Chinese language and literature at San Francisco State University. And it's a real pleasure to share with you some of my experiences teaching the classic Chinese novel in the context of popular culture, and today I will be focusing on Three Kingdoms, 三国演义. Sun Lao Shi asked me to start by answering maybe three questions that she kind of wanted to throw at all the presenters. And I'll start with that. Here's number one. Where do you think lies the value of teaching the classic Chinese novel, especially Three Kingdoms, in an American classroom? First of all, I truly think the world needs more Chinese literature, especially such fabulous novels like Three Kingdoms. And I think especially Three Kingdoms really combines almost everything a great work of fiction needs. Suspense, heroism, sacrifice, intrigue, humor, poetry. It really is a masterpiece and a great example of world literature, and that is why we have to teach it. Now, Three Kingdoms, because it's a historical novel, also draws on some of the most well-known historical figures, like Liu Bei, Guan Yu, Cao Cao, Zhuge Liang. And at the same time, it introduces the reader to some core Chinese cultural concepts, such as Confucianism, introduces the reader to important stratagems, some of which we also find in earlier texts, like Sun Tzu's The Art of War. So it really introduces us to some key figures and concepts of Chinese history, which is another reason I think why it's so important and so valuable to teach. And finally, the novel and its many characters have come to play a central role not just in Chinese culture, but of course in East Asian culture, in Korea, in Japan. And these aspects, of course, live on in many other works, adaptations of fiction, painting, operas, plays, temples and festivals, movies, video games, etc., etc. And many Americans, I think especially by way of video games, might actually have encountered the novel. Sometimes they don't even know that the video game, like Dynasty Warriors, is based on the Three Kingdoms. So here are just a few reasons why this is just such an important novel to teach. Question number two. What specific strategies or teaching methods have you used in your class to help motivate your students? Well, as I mentioned in the opening slide, usually when I teach this class, I lure the students in with the promise of popular culture. So I try to connect the novel always to adaptations and reinterpretations of the novel through popular culture. However, to appreciate those adaptations, we have to, of course, first read the novel. So I kind of trick them into the class by promising popular culture. However, once they start reading the novel, they never regret. They get drawn into the narrative right away and they love it. That being said, I do try to make the class as visual and tangible as possible by providing lots of visuals, maps, woodblock prints, my own photographs, and I'll share a few of those in this presentation. I also encourage students to compare this novel to works from the Western canon, such as the Iliad, the Nibelungenlied, King of Thrones, and I always encourage them to compare, to say what's different, to say what resonates, to tell me whether it reminds them of something from their own traditions. And finally, I already mentioned this, I try to establish a dialogue with the many adaptations that exist in popular culture, past and present. And here on the slide, of course, you have Dynasty Warriors, which is maybe now the most famous, but of course it's just one of them. Here are a few others. There are, of course, many comics, even just in English, from the Legends from China series, Three Kingdoms by Wei Dongchen in, I think it's 24 volumes. There are, of course, many computer games, not just Dynasty Warriors, Clash of Three Kingdoms, many others. And of course, there are so many movies. And then there are other things like Korean TV shows. And let me tell you, this semester I had a student who was emailing me one evening and said, I'm watching a Korean drama and they just said like Liu Bei, Guan Yu and Zhang Fei in the Peach Garden, they united, and I screamed at my mom that I got that reference. And then a couple of hours later she said, oh no, and now they mentioned the red hair too. Red hair, of course, being the Chituma. I just added that here. So you will see a lot of your students somewhat unexpectedly will actually latch onto the novel, might actually know the novel, and will be surprisingly interested in the narrative. And then here's question number 3 from Sun Laoshi. How do you apply these strategies in the lessons? What are the learning outcomes? So another big question. And what I wanted to do today is I kind of wanted to talk you through how I start teaching the novel. Essentially, the sort of opening classes, how to get them into that narrative, because I think that is almost the most difficult. How to familiarize them with the main characters and themes. Now, when I teach the class, I usually teach it in an abridged version. Here you have it on the right, Three Kingdoms, translated and abridged by Moss Roberts. And in the first couple of weeks, we kind of read the first 34 chapters. And the things I want them to sort of get a hang of are obviously the main themes. I always tell them, don't get bogged down by the details. The main events, the main characters, maybe the geography. I point out to them that there's of course a chronology in the back of the book. There is a name list, there is a map, and there is of course the internet. So Googling anything in that novel usually yields so much information, more information than the students could wish for, but it is of course a wonderful tool. Now before we plunge into the novel, I usually do tell them a few things about the novel. Tell them that it's attributed to Luo Guanzhong, who compiled it in the late 14th century, that the unabridged version consists of 120 chapters and over 1,000 characters. I do touch upon the Confucian angle of the novel because that does play such an important role all throughout the novel, and some of my teaching modules are dedicated just to Confucianism. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that when we meet during the live session. I repeat that it is of course very popular all over East Asia, and most importantly I want to emphasize that this is really a historical novel, and there are 2 important parts to this. Firstly, that it is based on history, that almost everything that happens in this novel really is based on historical events, historical figures, historical battles, historical localities. But at the same time, I want to emphasize that it is a historical novel, a retelling of official history, a fictional elaboration of history, so to speak, 7 parts facts and 3 parts fiction. And this is something I never want them to forget. So early on, I usually ask them, what is the difference between history and historical fiction? A deceptively easy question, or a question that seems deceptively easy, but it's actually not that easy, especially when you tie in the follow-up questions. Why is it important to distinguish between history and historical fiction? And then of course there is this really important question: why might a writer fictionalize certain aspects of history? Why might a writer choose to rewrite them in a certain way? Why might a writer choose to embellish them in a certain way? And this is really a question that accompanies us through the entire class. This idea, where does history and where does fiction take over, or where does fiction really impact the way we think of certain characters? Where does the author want us to perceive of a character in a certain way? Okay, now let's plunge into the novel. So if you've taught the novel, if you've read the novel, I know you all have, then there is of course this one difficulty. How do you deal with 1,000 characters and hundreds of battles and events and places when you have a classroom full of students who might not have heard of most of them? What are you going to focus on? How do you make sure that the students are able to follow the main characters and the main narrative? So I usually just start with a map of China, and I place the 3 kingdoms within the boundaries of today's China, and I tell them the time frame when the novel takes place, 2nd to 3rd century AD. And then I show them this lovely animated map, and I tell them that following the Han Dynasty, there was a period of disunion, of warlord rule, and you beautifully see here on this animated map how the empire falls apart into all these different competing warlord territories, and eventually you have these 3 power blocks that develop and that become dominant, and it's those 3 power blocks that eventually then compete for supremacy, compete to rule the realm, to rule China, to unite the country. And at that point, I tell them that really what we need to focus on in terms of the main narrative is, of course, those 3 kingdoms and the people affiliated with those 3 kingdoms. And once you do that, once you realize that, it's of course relatively easy to divide all those many characters more or less into these 3 camps. And of course, you all know that, right? We have the Wei kingdom, and we have Cao Cao affiliated with that. We have Shu, later Shu Han, and of course we have Liu Bei affiliated with that. And then we have the Wu kingdom, Sun Wu, and the Sun clan in the south. So I always try to make this complex narrative as simple and tangible as possible. And just as I try to sort of make the history tangible, I do the same with the characters. So I try to focus in on characters. And that's of course relatively easy because we know the novel starts right out with 3 of our main heroes, right? The 3 bold spirits, Hao Jie San, Jie Yi. And that is of course Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhang Fei. And I always work closely with the text. So I want the students to essentially characterize our heroes by way of the information they get from the text, from the opening chapters. And there are, of course, a bunch of things that we learn right away, right? About Liu Bei being distantly related to the imperial line. We know that he is so virtuous, right? That he has all these great characteristics. We know something about the weapons he carries. And the same, of course, goes for the others, for Guan Yu and Zhang Fei. So we sort of can try to characterize them, both the physical descriptions, the weapons they have, but of course, very importantly, their characters as well, because obviously they are very different. Now, as I said, I always try to visualize it. I always have examples from different different articulations of popular culture accompany my lectures. But I also ask students to engage with those visuals. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Now, we can do this for really, the main characters in the opening, or we can do this throughout the novel, right? Obviously, we have to focus on Cao Cao. We might focus on Sun Jian. Then there are other, maybe lesser characters. Dong Zhuo is always a favorite of students. Lü Bu, Diao Chan. And I usually provide a list of whom I think are main characters and students might want to focus on. And depending on the level and the level of interest and also the time we have for the class, that list might be longer or shorter. But once we sort of have decided on a number of characters we want to focus on, I assign students a task to learn more about these characters. So again, depending on the class size, I might ask them to choose a character, or I might assign a character to them. If there's a lot of students, I might actually pair students, with another student to talk about one character, sometimes even small groups, 3 or 4. And I present them with a couple of questions. So first, in what important ways do the characters differ or distinguish themselves from each other? So I want them to get a sense for the fact that these characters, of course, have a lot of things in common, right? Most of them are brave and they're great fighters, but there are, of course, key differences, especially when it comes to the characters, the definition of virtue, the motivations for doing things, etc. And then, for that one character they chose or had been assigned to work on, let's say, a student chose to work on Liu Bei, I want them to do 2 things. I tell them, try to learn as much about the character by conducting some research. And research, of course, these days usually just means more or less extensive online searches. But what I want them to learn is that these are, of course, historical figures, but the historical records of some of them do not quite match their characterization in the novel. So who is the historical figure? How does that historical figure differ maybe from what we learned in the novel? How do we account for some of those differences? And then I asked them to find visual depictions of these characters from popular culture or just from anywhere. And I want them to reflect, do these depictions match what they would have imagined the character to look like? Why or why not? And here on the left, of course, we have a Japanese woodblock print of Liu Bei. But there are, of course, so many, right? I already mentioned Dynasty Warriors. Dynasty Warriors, of course, now gives us hundreds of amazing visuals of all of these heroes. I mentioned that I work with comics that I make available to the students. This is from the Legends from China comic series. Here is another Japanese woodblock print, and you've noticed that for now I'm just focusing on these three swan brothers. Liu Bei here in the center on the horse, Guan Yu with the red face, and Zhang Fei, right? So I want them to get a sense of the way these characters are represented in popular culture in a way that they become, of course, highly recognizable to people. Right? All of us would pick out the red face of Guan Yu right here with his big halberd. Right? And then we have CCTV, TV adaptations. We have comics. And again, right, some of the characteristics are always there. Some of the clothing is always there. Here we have representations from Jingju. We have it from hand puppet plays, 布袋戏, shadow figures. All of these, of course, are essentially representations from popular culture. Maybe not popular culture from contemporary times, but throughout ages. Here we have another scene from a Beijing opera. This time Zhang Fei and Liu Bei. And then this is one of my favorites. This is actually one that a student brought to my attention a couple of years ago after the student had watched Jia Zhangke's latest movie, 江湖儿女, Ash is Pure as White. And she showed me this screenshot, and there, of course, is Lord Guan Yu, God of War and Code of Honor, right? So these figures really do show up in a lot of examples from popular culture, different mediums, different eras. And that is always fun for students to realize, to find, to match their expectations with the depictions of others. So this is really, I find, a very good way to get students just kind of into the novel. Now, something that I always do to help students stay on track is to work with low-stakes reading quizzes. And let me show you that by actually showing you the quiz function in our course management system. So these are usually very easy questions. Often they are yes or no or multiple choice. And I always give students 2 or more attempts. So it kind of, if they get it wrong, they have to go back to the novel and try to get it right, right? So the opening of the novel is full of auspicious omens. And the dynasty proppers. The author of the novel thinks the Yellow Scarves, led by Zhang Ju, are a force of good in the empire. True, false? The main reason for Liu Bei, Zhang Fei, and Guan Yu together in the Peach Garden is to get drunk, to have a fight, to take an oath, to serve the emperor. Right? So you see these questions, they make you laugh, some of them, because they might be obvious, they might be funny. But that way, I really just want to make sure they stay on track with the reading. Now, something else that I do in addition to the quizzes is I ask them to write short reading responses, usually once a week. And giving them simple prompts usually helps them to focus, but at the same time, they're also free to respond on just things that pique their interest. But usually, again, I ask them to focus maybe on a character they like or they don't like. And then there might be follow-up questions that might relate to issues such as Confucianism, what motivates certain actions, etc. And I usually ask them to work closely with the text and to give me textual evidence. And I think we can talk a little bit more about that in our face-to-face session in a few days. Now, one last thing that I do, and I told you that the class is specifically termed the classic Chinese novel in popular culture, and that is at the end of a module, when we finished reading the novel, I actually want them to focus on one adaptation, be it a comic, be it a movie, be it a computer game, be it a Beijing opera, be it whatever, be it a CCTV adaptation. And I want them to compare the two. I want them to describe one or two differences they've noticed. I want them to reflect on why those differences exist, why those changes have been made. And the same goes for similarities, where aspects of the novel have been preserved. So this is my approach to Three Kingdoms. This is how I usually start teaching it, how I try to get them drawn into the narrative, and how at the end I sort of tie it back together with popular culture. And I look forward to talking about in more detail during our face-to-face section in a few days, and I really look forward to your questions. So until then, be well and take care.
In a country shaken by years of civil war, a powerful warlord's quest for domination threatens all who stand in his way. Now, the destiny of an empire and the fate of millions will depend on the fight of a few. From legendary director John Woo comes a new epic like no other. Red Cliff, a John Woo film.